got today after I was talking that kind of relates to what I'm talking about today. Some of the frustrations that I had following a referendum that was held last year in Australia. And when I was looking at this presentation, I got a little bit concerned that I was being overly critical of our people, Aboriginal people, at home. And you're going to see why I thought it was critical of some of our people. So I wanted to start by criticising the colony first. Australia is a colony. There's no treaty. There's no agreement with Indigenous peoples. It's well and truly a colony. It was invaded in 1788 on the premise of terra nullius, which means a land belonging to no one. So they literally did not recognise us as peoples with any kind of structure. So even calling the place Australia to me is problematic, and it's even further problematic for me to identify as Australian. I never identify myself as Australian. First and foremost, I'm a Wollongonga, I'm a Mandalay, and then after that, the next term I use a lot of the time is Aboriginal, and that in itself is an enforced term. A lot of people are now turning to First Nations as a term, because they say Aboriginal is an English word, it's actually Latin, but I'm kind of saying First Nations, I think is English as well. And then it's even more problematic when people double it up with First Nations Australian. I find these terms problematic. So I just wanted to open with that because I am critical of some of our own people through this. So basically, the referendum it was a simple message that people said they were confused about. So basically, the population of Australia was asked to vote to amend the Australian Constitution to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Island peoples as the first peoples of the continent. And as part of that recognition in the Constitution, to establish a voice to Parliament, so to be a council, I suppose, of Aboriginal and Torres Island people who would give direct advice to the government and Parliament of the day, which would then also lead to a treaty, or treaties, I should say, and also a truth-telling commission. So this was what it's all about. So quite a simple message, I think. Became overly complicated. There was more than a decade worth of work from many Aboriginal people and Torres Island people to get it to where it was, to create the framework for the referendum, I suppose. And the polls from when the referendum was first announced, kind of around 2018, were showing a continual support, 80% Aboriginal people supporting the referendum, 20%, the bulk of the 20% weren't supportive of the yes vote on the premise of sovereignty, which we're going to talk about as well. So this is what the referendum was about. But it failed. And it failed within about 10 minutes of the voting counting. So for a yes vote to get up, you need 51% of the population to vote yes, and a majority of the states, so 7 states. So the bar's pretty high. So it failed very quickly, and it highlighted the racism that exists in the colony. And so, I think someone mentioned this the other day as well, that education is political. And this forms a major reason as to why I was supporting yes, because education is political. I went to school, and when I was at school, the message that we got was, the education that we received was that Captain Cook discovered Australia. Okay? How do you discover something that's already occupied? By, I'll get too political. And that was part of the reason. So in terms of that politicisation of education, I wanted to throw these two maps up. to show the difference between how they're well used. So this is a map of Aboriginal nations across the continent. So before 1788, there was more than 440 distinct languages that were spoken and thousands of dialects. Since 1788, only 40 of those languages have been continually spoken.
Sorry, how many? 40?
40.
40.
40. So there's 120 languages that are spoken today, but 80 of those have been taken from the dormant, and so they've been revitalised in that way. Jane and I, we spoke Wollongong yesterday, which is this region. So we're in close proximity to Sydney, so where invasion happened. And so from pretty much here down to here, here, all of these languages are critically endangered. Wollongong would be the strongest language, although we only have 30 people who we consider proficient and highly proficient in our language. So what Gailani presented yesterday is quite special for us. So we shared that story, Yuladala story, who created and put all the different languages in the country. So that's where he went. The man who shines like the sun. So that's our map, and this is the colonial map showing certain states. And so we have a federal government, and each state has its own state government as well. So each state has different educational policies. So New South Wales, where we are, has the most stringent rules around schools and establishing schools. So we've set up an independent school, Wollongong Gingana Freedom School. So we've had to work through the framework that is the most difficult, basically. And these are all the reasons for my stance throughout last year. And when we consider the education of our people, we need to consider the recent historical events. So in 2006, the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, which is a government-funded media agency, ran a program on what was called Lateline, and they made the accusation that every Aboriginal community in the Northern Territory has pedophile rings. And so they had a guy who had his sitting in the shadows, who was claiming to be a community worker who worked in these communities and seen all of these atrocities happening in Aboriginal communities to Aboriginal children. So he claimed to be a community worker. It was actually this guy, who was the chief of staff of this guy, Mal Ruff, who was the Aboriginal Affairs Minister at the time. Okay. So that instigated what they called the emergency response in the Northern Territory, which instigated the Northern Territory intervention. And as part of that intervention, they literally sent in the army to all these Aboriginal communities, and they forced children into health checks, sexual health checks. So, talk about trauma and inflicting trauma on children. There you go. The government, through this process, the government also forcibly acquired Aboriginal lands. So it was an attempt to get people off homelands in order to open up the money and demonise Aboriginal people at the same time. This is what it did. So it was very dehumanising policy, which has only just been ended when the Labor government came in 2022. The official policy finally stopped. So before that, in 1970, so politics and goodwill in Australia has gone backwards since the 70s. So in 1976, the federal government established a bilingual education policy in the Northern Territory. Language was strong at that time, and well, they call it bilingual, but it was really immersion. So children were educated in their mother tongue. So this is in communities where Aboriginal languages are the first language. English was a lot of time fourth or fifth language. So in the olden days, our people were multilingual, which is kind of starting to disappear, that multilingualism. So children were brought up in their mother tongue all the way until grade 4, so the age of 10. And then, so in grade 5, an hour of English would be implemented, and then sort of it would go up to 50-50 from there. So they called it bilingual schools, but it was really immersion, because it was about making education meaningful. It's hard for education to be meaningful if it's not in your first language, right? And so that was the whole premise of it. So what they did in 2008, they abolished bilingual schools without saying they're abolishing bilingual schools. What they said was the first 4 hours of instruction has to be in English. So they abolished bilingual education. So they applied this to all, even preschools, early years education. They said even in early years, it needs to be the first 4 hours in English. So it's a simulation, straight up simulation. That was up, so as I said, these schools were set up in 1976. There was continued pressure put on them by conservative governments to change. And so by 2008, so at the height, there was 19 schools that were bilingual schools, that were state schools. By 2008, there was 8. So we could see the continual attacks on the way our humans educate our children. So this is one of the protests from 1999, we think. So it's important to understand that history. This cartoon here is from 2016. It's one of a series of cartoons. And you can just see this community of demonized. So as I said, this is 2016 in the Australian newspaper. It's one of 6 cartoons. I'm not going to pick any of those with equal effect. And so what people talk about is they say they've got a fear for our children and deficient numeracy, but it's all fake because they don't actually really care. And what also was implemented in 2008 was NAPLAN, the National Assessment Program of Literacy and Numeracy. So that NAPLAN test, they test children on their literacy and numeracy proficiency in English in years 3, 5, 7, and 9. But the bilingual school taught only Aboriginal languages till year 4. So the children who were sitting on year 3 NAPLAN test don't know English yet, haven't been taught in English. And so they were saying all these Aboriginal children are illiterate in these communities, and it's because of language. So they need to do 4 hours in English to get the literacy and numeracy up. The children were literate. They're literate in their mother tongue. They're proficient in their literacy and mother tongue. So this is how the government goes about watering down the way we want to teach our children and to keep our languages alive. Governments are contradictory, right? So in 2007, the Conservative government introduced the Northern Territory Intervention. They were then voted out the same year, and in 2008, the Prime Minister made an official apology to the stolen generations, Aboriginal people who were forcibly removed from their parents and their families. Made that apology, but continued the Northern Territory Intervention. So, can't really figure it out. And then they also made, the federal government made a commitment to report on what they call closing the gap, socioeconomic factors. So originally there was only 5 areas: health, housing, education, employment, and incarceration. That was the original premise on how they go about reporting on closing the gap. It's grown since then. So we started a 15-year life expectancy gap. It has improved since I was in school. It was 30 years. As late as 2002, life expectancy gap between Aboriginal people and the population. And so we just have alarming rates in all of these areas. And it's only been within the last 5 years that governments have finally agreed to report on the health and vitality of Aboriginal languages. Because as we've been, I think it was talked about yesterday as well, culture is healing and makes our people strong. So they've only just started to figure that out after many years of our people telling them that. So close the gaps has become a bit of a buzzword though. And this statement here is from Dr. Jigan actually in 2008. And the gap that politicians now talk of grows larger as we speak, as I talk. I don't think anyone except the few of us who have lived our lives in the Aboriginal world understand this task that is called closing the gap. No one in power speaks an Aboriginal language, let alone the ability to sit with a young man or woman and share that person's experience. So this is when they start getting rid of bilingual schools. So he's from Arnhem, at the top in a remote area where languages, they're some of our strongest languages up in Arnhem. They're spoken intergenerationally, and the children learn four languages before they learn English. So many things are still intact. And so he made this statement, and then he said we need for our people and our communities to be recognising the Constitution so we can protect what's most important, language. And that's what started the process around the referendum. Okay? And I've got two photos here of two ladies from Utakala School up in Arnhem. This lady over here just recently retired after 40 years of working in the school. This lady is the principal of the school. So when the Northern Territory government came to them in the start of 2009 and said, you need to teach 4 hours of English to start the day, they just said, we're not doing that. So they stood firm in what they do and wouldn't adhere to what the government was telling them. So very powerful stuff. And that school is still going great guns. What Dr. Yunapingu also did, so this community in Arnhem is very proactive as well. So they started what's called the Dharma Festival up there. So they invite all politicians and dignitaries to this festival of culture. Thousands of people go to this festival now, and that's where they started launching the referendum movement, I suppose. And on Dr. Yunapingu's guidance. So this is where I start to get critical of our own people too. In the middle here is Linda Burney. Linda has 50 years of working in Aboriginal education and working for the betterment of our communities through education and also politics. So she has just recently resigned as the Aboriginal Affairs Minister. She's done a whole lot for people. And she jumped on board with the referendum and supported that vision for the referendum to happen. So she was the leader of the Yes movement, I suppose, or she was kind of the poster of the Yes movement as the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. To the left here, Lydia Thorpe, she was one of the faces of No, of the No movement. She was a face of the No movement based around sovereignty and the idea that our sovereignty would be squashed by the referendum. The contradiction being that she was a member of Parliament. Right? So I agree with a lot of her rhetoric, but also a lot of contradiction. And this lady here is Jacinta Price. She is a far-right conservative politician, which I find it hard to figure out as well. So she was on the no because she was saying we're all Australian. There's bigger issues for Aboriginal people to be worrying about. Aboriginal people don't deserve anything more than anyone else. And in fact, Aboriginal women and children were saved when white men arrived. again, there's all these kind of contradictions because Jacinta's mum worked in a bilingual school in Northern Territory, Virginia, I think. And so she knows the language pretty well. When I hear her speak Walbury, it's pretty good, so I kind of struggle to figure this. There's many dynamics here that I struggle to understand. Yeah, so that was one of the key drivers of each one, on the left and the right. So on the left here in green, got the sort of very far left sovereignty movement. So we vote no, sovereignty never ceded. We cannot enter into a treaty with a corrupt illegal government. We want nothing to do with Australia. So I think we can all understand that. Makes sense? 100%. I understand that. What I forgot to say is that Lydia Thorpe on the left before, she's the leader of the what's called the Black Sovereignty Movement. Again, you vote no, sovereignty never ceded. We need to go straight to treaty before the referendum. We need treaty first. And there are other ways to forward our community, but nothing is specified. In the middle, we have the yes voters, the 40%, and 80% of the Aboriginal community was in blue. We vote yes. We also recognise the sovereignty of never ceded, but let's establish the voice as a mechanism to work towards treaties. We know it's not perfect, but it's a conversation starter. That was where we started. Then we had the right. If you don't know, vote no. As I said, the message was pretty simple, right? But they complicated it, and it became a catchphrase. If you don't know, vote no. So we vote no, we're all Australian. Those blackfellas are going to come and take our land. How ironic, right? And what about me? What about us? We deserve stuff too. And on the far right of that, we vote no, Aboriginal people are staying into primitives, and as I said before, Aboriginal women and children were saved by white men. I know. And we can't let them have anything. So this was what was happening. So a lot of it was hard to understand. And there was all kinds of racism, but also very unhelpful natural violence within our communities. So Linda was painted as an elite black, and these elite blacks don't represent Aboriginal people across the whole continent. Things like that. The term coconut was used by our community, so brown on the outside, white on the inside. So you're a set-out coconut hog if you were supporting the yes vote. With some of this rhetoric that was going on. And it really wasn't helpful. And you may, I've got the left here and the right here in the same colour. And even though they're different ends of the political spectrum usually, the left and the right, during the referendum, they were the same colour. Because they colluded and worked together to bring it down. So, this is probably getting a bit critical of some of our people, but really my criticism really lies on the colony. So, as I said, I was supporting the yes vote because I saw it, the voice to Parliament as a way to lead to a charter school similar system for us to educate our children the way we see fit, and to have that voice to Parliament protecting languages and cultures. That's what I really wanted for that. To lead the treaties and the Truth-Telling Commission, and a lot of it, when people were criticising me for my stance, well, I've actually got an experience of establishing a school and navigating the colonial system. And my experience is that's the reason why I'm taking the position that I am. And so I've got a photo of two very important Gumbaynggirr elders here, Uncle Trevor and Uncle Martin Ballingo. Unfortunately, we lost Uncle Trevor in March this year. But the reason I've got that photo is because Uncle Trevor was a big supporter of a yes vote, his name with the hat. But Uncle Martin was, at the start, no. And he was no because he doesn't trust government. So you can completely understand. But they disagreed, but they weren't toxic to each other. And that's why I put that photo up there. Uncle Martin is colourful elder. So this is and this is the two old men who I just showed. This is their cousin Auntie B, Ballingarry, and myself and my father speaking at a yes event to try and get the non-Aboriginal population to understand and to vote yes. Auntie B brought images of her parents that day, and she said, "I need their strength today." At the start, but then when Dad got up to do the welcome, he was heckled within about 30 seconds by the far right. And when Auntie B was speaking, she's 80, and she was telling her story of she wasn't able to be born at this hospital in Barraville, so her mum had to walk 50 kilometres to Bellingen. People were heckling her, and how you can heckle an 80-year-old woman is telling the story. So I was starting to arc up. I was starting to get really agitated at this. And so this is the kind of stuff that was happening, and I was wanting to protect our daughter from a lot of all of our children. That type of time. The vote, the polls before the referendum were correct, and more than 80% of our population voted yes. Aboriginal population. As I said before, the issue of sovereignty was the reason why some of our people were so against it. And so it got to a point where I was really starting to question if I was correct in supporting yes. And I was like, geez, am I wrong here by supporting yes? Am I giving up our sovereignty for this? So I went and spoke to one of our elders, who was also one of the first two Aboriginal people to attend University of Sydney, and he graduated in law. And I asked, I said, am I wrong here? Do we need to be worried about sovereignty? And he giggled. And he said, oh, sovereignty is a white concept. And I kind of went, the colour must have gone out of me. And he's looking at me and he said, well, do we have kings and queens? Princes and princesses? I said, no. He's like, sovereignty is a white concept. And he said, and this mob that are talking on sovereignty, I'm viewing it through a white lens. So I was like, whoa, okay. So I'll keep reading, but it's something to think about because, but it's important. It's important because this next one, 10% of the Aboriginal Torres people, population, speaks their language. That's it.
So you're increasing that, Clark.
Yeah, we're increasing it. But what's sovereignty without language? What's sovereignty without culture? And that was the point that Uncle was making to me. So there was people who were avidly talking about sovereignty who made no attempt on their language and culture to learn or to speak their language or to know their culture. They made no attempt, and yet they speak on sovereignty. So there's a contradiction there. And this is where my criticism, as I said, I was worried about my criticism of our own people, but these are the things that need to be spoken about. I've got a photo here. You might recognise Ellie from yesterday in the video. A number of our kids, Troy and Rowan, all of these people here speak Woombenga well, and as part of bringing the language back and sovereignty back. It depends on language and culture. Us having language and culture, in my opinion. So this poster is post-referendum. So basically saying, get your kids to school. And where we're from, in Coffs Harbour, Woombenga country, 75% of the population voted no. Right? So why would we want to send our kids to a mainstream school when 75% of the teachers don't have enough respect for those children to simply vote yes? And so, the blame is on our community all the time. You've got to get your kids to school. Well, it's a cultural place of cultural genocide. It's called mainstream schools. And when people act like they care, oh, but what about opportunities for your children? what about the literacy and numeracy? You don't care. You voted no. So it shows us that you don't care. And so I suppose one of the positives of a no vote in the yes movement in the non-Aboriginal community, there was problematic language and naivety in non-Aboriginal people who voted yes as well. They were awoken to the racism that we face, and they were asking me questions about literacy and numeracy as well. And so after that, I've been able to say, well, everyone else doesn't care, but our community does. So we need to be able to educate our children the way we see fit. So we need to continue this language revitalisation work, establish our own schools and have a charter system with Aboriginal teachers and our cultural ones will be super important. So this image here is Alani Jenny, who's one of our children residents at our school, and this little baby she's got, that's the baby's first smoking ceremony at our first day of our school this year. And so a potentially scary future. So just recently, the Northern Territory voted in a far-right government in Northern Territory. In the lead up to the referendum, we had some small wins where we raised the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 12. Small win, but a win. Since the new government's come in Northern Territory, they've taken it back to 10. In the lead up to the referendum, 100% of the children who were incarcerated in juvenile detention were Aboriginal children. So they're just perpetuating this cycle again. So at a federal level, if Peter Dutton, the member with the glasses, he's the leader of the Liberal National Government. If he becomes Prime Minister at next year's election, he's already committed to the establishment of 5 nuclear power plants. And then his Aboriginal Affairs Minister will be Jacinta Price, who also the Aboriginal women and children were saved by white men. So that's what we may be facing. And so we've got to keep working hard, basically, because that's what and so in terms of our school, if we have to fight against that type of government, it's going to be a hard, long road. So that's me.